It was just a family photo from the Old West. Upon zooming in, historians were left speechless. The spring afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Henderson's auction house in Tucson, Arizona, casting long shadows across tables crowded with forgotten relics. Dr. Robert Hayes moved methodically through the estate sale items, his trained eye scanning daggers, brass compasses, and leather-bound journals that spoke of lives lived a century ago. At 42, Robert had spent 15 years studying the American frontier, and he'd learned that history's most compelling stories often hid in plain sight. He almost walked past the wooden crate filled with old photographs. Most auction-goers dismissed such collections. Faded faces of strangers held little monetary value. But Robert saw them differently. Each image was a window into a moment frozen in time. He lifted the top photograph carefully, its edges brown and brittle. The image showed a homesteader family standing before a modest wooden house, the kind that dotted the Arizona Territory in the late 1880s. A man and woman stood at the center, flanked by 3 children whose serious expressions reflected the solemnity required by long exposure times. The landscape behind them stretched flat and unforgiving desert scrubland punctuated by distant mountains. Robert turned it over. On the back, written in faded ink, "The Douglas Family, 1889, near Tombstone." He felt the familiar quickening of his pulse. Tombstone had been a powder keg during that era. Silver mines, gunfighters, and fortunes won and lost in the span of a heartbeat. He pulled out his portable magnifying loupe and returned to the image. The woman wore a simple calico dress, her hair pulled back severely. The children, 2 boys and a girl, stood rigid, their clothes patched but clean. But it was the man who drew Robert's attention. As Robert adjusted the loupe's focus, his breath caught. The man's hands bore distinctive scarring, thick, raised marks across both palms and several fingers. These weren't random scars of ranch work. They formed a pattern Robert had seen before in his research on frontier criminals. These were rope burns, the kind left by repeated binding, the signature of a man who'd spent time in restraints. Robert's mind raced through possibilities. He purchased the entire crate without negotiation, barely hearing the auctioneer's cheerful remarks. As he carried the crate to his car, the Douglas family photo remained on top, the scarred hands visible even without magnification. Something wasn't right about this peaceful homesteader, and Robert intended to find out what. Robert's office at the Arizona Historical Society occupied a corner of the museum's research wing, its walls lined with filing cabinets and reference books chronicling the territory's turbulent past. He'd worked through the night, cross-referencing the Douglas photograph with territorial records. Now surrounded by scattered papers and half-empty coffee cups, he stared at a discovery that made no sense. The scarring pattern on the man's hands matched descriptions from a wanted poster in the National Archives database. The poster, dated 1884, sought a man named James Callan for armed robbery and assault on a Wells Fargo coach outside Silver City, New Mexico. The description included an unusual detail: distinctive rope scars on both hands from previous capture and escape. Robert enlarged the photograph on his computer screen, enhancing the contrast. The similarities were undeniable. The shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, even the slight asymmetry of the nose, everything aligned with the rough sketch on the wanted poster. But the poster indicated Callan had been killed in a shootout with lawmen in 1886, 3 years before this family photograph was taken. He called Margaret, a colleague at the University of Arizona's Forensic Anthropology Department. They'd collaborated on several historical identification projects, and her expertise in comparative analysis had proven invaluable. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice groggy. "Robert, it's 6 in the morning. I need you to look at something. Can you come to my office?" The urgency in his tone cut through her irritation. "Give me an hour." Margaret arrived carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She peered at the dual images on his screen, the wanted poster beside the enhanced family photograph. "Tell me what you see," Robert said. Margaret leaned closer, her analytical mind processing the visual information. After several minutes of silent comparison, she straightened. The bone structure matches. Cheekbones, orbital spacing, mandible shape. They're consistent. But Robert, if this is the same man, he didn't die in 1886. She traced the scars visible on the photograph. These marks tell a story. Rope burns this severe suggest multiple periods of restraint, probably during transport. Which means your peaceful homesteader was living under an assumed identity. The question is why, and how did a wanted outlaw transform into a family man without anyone noticing? The Cochise County Courthouse stood as a testament to frontier justice, its weathered stone facade bearing witness to decades of legal proceedings. Robert and Margaret arrived on a Tuesday morning, when the archive room would be least crowded. The county clerk, an elderly man named Frank, greeted them with enthusiasm. "Looking for records from 1889? Frank adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling as he pulled open a massive drawer. "That was a busy year in Tombstone. What name are you researching?" "Douglas," Robert said. A family that settled near Tombstone probably purchased land around 1887 or 1888. Frank's fingers walked through yellowed files with practiced efficiency. Douglas? Here we are. William Douglas filed a homestead claim in March 1887, purchased additional acreage in 1888. According to these documents, he came from California with his wife Ellen and 3 children. Robert felt his pulse quicken. Any prior records? Where in California? Doesn't specify, just says Sacramento area. Frank spread the papers across the archive table. Strange thing, though, there's a gap. Most homesteaders had letters of reference, previous land deeds, something establishing identity. Douglas's file is remarkably thin. Margaret photographed each document while Robert took notes. The homestead claim described 160 acres of desert land. The family had built a modest house, dug a well, and planted crops, fulfilling all requirements. On paper, William Douglas was an exemplary settler, but Robert noticed what wasn't there. No birth certificates, no marriage certificate, no prior tax records. William Douglas appeared in Arizona territory fully formed, like a character stepping onto a stage without backstory. Frank, would you have records of any incidents involving the Douglas family? Legal troubles? Conflicts with neighbors? The old clerk disappeared into the back rooms. He returned carrying a slim folder. Found one thing. In 1888, a neighboring rancher filed a complaint, claimed Douglas appropriated water from a shared spring. The matter was settled privately, but there's a note from the territorial marshal who investigated. He handed Robert a single page. Marshal Edward Garrett had written, "Visited Douglas property. Dispute resolved amicably. Douglas demonstrated detailed knowledge of water rights law, unusual for a common farmer. Subject uncomfortable with questioning appeared anxious to conclude interview quickly. No cause for suspicion, but manner was notable." Robert and Margaret exchanged glances. A homesteader with extensive legal knowledge and an aversion to law enforcement, the profile was becoming clearer. Sacramento's heat hit them like a physical force as Robert and Margaret stepped off the plane 3 days later. If William Douglas had truly come from California, someone might remember him, or remember why he'd left. They'd mapped out their route: county records offices, historical societies, and the state archives. The California State Archives occupied a modern building that seemed incongruous with the historical documents it housed. A research librarian named Patricia helped them navigate the territorial-era records, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "You're looking for any William Douglas who left the Sacramento area around 1886 or 1887? Patricia's screen filled with results. "That's a common name. I'm showing 43 possibilities." "Can you filter for men with wives named Ellen and 3 children in the right age range?" Margaret asked. The list shortened to 7 names. Robert worked through each systematically. Most could be eliminated quickly. Wrong ages, different wives, or families remaining in California past 1887. But one entry stopped him cold. William Douglas, Sacramento resident, worked as a clerk at a mining company. Wife Ellen, children Thomas, Samuel, and Mary. The census record from 1880 showed him living a respectable life. Then, in 1886, the family vanished from all records. "Margaret, look at this." She pulled up newspaper archives for Sacramento, 1886. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then Margaret's screen froze on an article from the Sacramento Union, dated October 1886. The headline read, "Mining Company Clerk Questioned in Embezzlement Investigation." The article was brief. The Continental Mining Company had discovered financial irregularities. William Douglas, a trusted clerk, had been questioned but not charged. The investigation was ongoing. So William Douglas was suspected of embezzlement, but then nothing, Margaret finished. No follow-up articles, no trial, no resolution. The investigation just stops, and the family disappears. Robert leaned back, processing the implications. What if William Douglas was innocent? What if he ran because he knew he'd never get a fair trial? Or, Margaret said quietly, what if he was guilty, took embezzled money, and used it to start fresh in Arizona? They requested copies of every document related to the Sacramento William Douglas. As they waited, Robert studied the scarred hands in the photograph once more. If this was William Douglas the clerk, how had he gotten rope scars matching outlaw James Callan? Unless both names were false identities, masks worn by someone who'd learned to disappear whenever his past caught up. The Continental Mining Company no longer existed, but its records had been preserved in the Sacramento Historical Society's business archives. Robert and Margaret spent their second day in California surrounded by leather-bound ledgers that smelled of dust and decay, searching for the financial irregularities that had driven a clerk to flee. A volunteer archivist named Daniel, a retired accountant with a passion for historical bookkeeping, helped them navigate the company's Byzantine record-keeping system. His weathered hands turned pages with reverence. "The embezzlement case of 1886, Daniel muttered, scanning index entries. "Yes, I remember cataloging these files. The company nearly collapsed over it. Here we are." He He produced a box containing correspondence, financial ledgers, and investigation reports. Beginning in early 1885, someone had been systematically siphoning funds from the company's operating accounts. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums. By September 1886, nearly $20,000 had vanished. William Douglas, as senior accounting clerk, had access to the accounts in question. When discrepancies were discovered, he became the immediate suspect. But the investigation reports revealed troubling inconsistencies. The handwriting on several fraudulent transfer orders didn't match Douglas's documented script. The timing of some transactions occurred when Douglas had been verifiably absent from the office. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a letter dated October 15, 1886. It was from the company's president to the territorial marshal, requesting that charges against Douglas be dropped due to insufficient evidence. They cleared him, so why did he run? Robert found the answer 3 pages later, a letter from Douglas himself to the company president, dated October 20th, 1886. "Sir, I am grateful for your faith in my innocence, but I can no longer remain in Sacramento. The true embezzler remains unknown, and I have received threats against my family. Last night, someone attempted to break into our home. My wife is terrified, and my children can no longer attend school without harassment. I must protect them. I ask only that you provide a letter stating my innocence. We will be gone by week's end." "He wasn't running from the law," Margaret said slowly. "He was running from whoever framed him." Daniel had been reading over their shoulders. "You know, 2 years later, the company's vice president was arrested for fraud. Turned out he'd been embezzling for years. Could be your man Douglas got too close to figuring it out." Robert felt pieces clicking into place. An honest man, falsely accused, fleeing to protect his family. That explained Sacramento. But it didn't explain the rope scars or the match to James Callan. "We need to go back further," Robert said. "Before Sacramento, we need to find out who this man was before he became William Douglas." The New Mexico Territory Archives in Santa Fe occupied a former mission building, its thick adobe walls keeping the interior cool. Robert and Margaret arrived on a Friday afternoon, their research having traced James Callan's criminal career back to its origins. If William Douglas and James Callan were the same man, the truth would be buried somewhere in these records. An archivist named Sophia greeted them, her efficiency evident in the way she had already pulled relevant files. Wanted posters, arrest records, newspaper clippings, and witness statements filled 2 large boxes. "James Callan," Sophia said, organizing materials chronologically. "Career criminal, operated primarily between 1882 and 1886, but his story starts earlier. In 1878, a young man named James Callan was arrested for theft in Santa Fe. He was 19 years old. She laid out the arrest report. The description matched. Same height, same build, same physical features that would later appear on wanted posters, but the crime was minor, stealing food and supplies from a general store. The sentence? 6 months in territorial jail." "That's where the rope scars began," Margaret said, reading the jailer's notes. "Attempted escape, June 1878. Prisoner subdued and restrained. Attempted escape, July 1878. Additional restraints applied. Attempted escape, August 1878. The pattern continued. Young James Callan had tried to escape 9 times during his 6-month sentence, each attempt earning him longer periods in restraints. The scars on his hands would have been forming even then. Robert found the discharge papers. Callan was released in January 1879. Then the records went dark for 3 years. Nothing until the Wells Fargo robbery in 1882 that launched his criminal career. What happened in those 3 years? Robert wondered aloud. Sophia had anticipated the question. "I pulled everything on Callan's background. His parents died when he was 17. Cholera outbreak in 1876. No siblings, no other family. The theft in 1878 was probably desperation." Margaret was examining the wanted posters closely. The robberies were strategic. He never hurt anyone unnecessarily. Witnesses described him as polite, even apologetic. One stagecoach passenger said Callan apologized for frightening her and returned her wedding ring. "And after each robbery, Callan disappeared completely," Sophia added. "Other outlaws showed up in saloons, gambling halls. Callan vanished. Law enforcement could never figure out where he went between crimes." Robert felt understanding dawn. Because he wasn't living as an outlaw between robberies. He was living as someone else. He'd learned to create false identities. Sophia produced a final document, the report of Callan's death in 1886. 2 territorial marshals had cornered him near the Mexican border. A shootout ensued. Callan was reportedly killed, his body buried in an unmarked grave. "But there's no death certificate," Margaret observed. "No coroner's report, no physical evidence." "Many historians have questioned whether Callan actually died," Sophia said. "The timing was convenient. It's possible the marshals accepted a bribe, reported him dead to close the case." Robert looked at the photograph of William Douglas, then at the young man in the 1878 arrest record. The same eyes stared out from both images. "He didn't die," Robert said. "He paid the marshals, traveled to Sacramento, created a new identity as William Douglas, got a respectable job, started a family. He was finally free. Until the embezzlement investigation," Margaret added. "Until his past started catching up again, and he had to run one more time." Finding descendants of the Douglas family required patient genealogical work, tracing lines through marriage records, census data, and cemetery records across 3 states. After 2 weeks of searching, Robert located Mary Douglas's great-granddaughter living in Phoenix. Her name was Patricia Hayes, no relation to Robert, and she agreed to meet them at her home. Patricia was in her 70s, her living room filled with family photographs spanning generations. She welcomed them warmly, clearly excited to discuss ancestors she'd only known through stories passed down like treasured heirlooms. "My great-grandmother Mary rarely talked about her childhood," Patricia said, pouring tea. "But my grandmother, Mary's daughter, she remembered some things. Stories about the early days near Tombstone, about her father, about why they lived so quietly." Robert showed Patricia the enhanced photograph. The old woman's eyes filled with tears as she studied the image. "That's them. Mary's the little girl in the middle. Great-grandmother always said her father was the gentlest man she'd ever known, despite everything." Patricia set the photograph down carefully. "She said he'd lived many lives before finding them. That's the phrase she used. Many lives?" "Did she ever explain what that meant?" Margaret asked gently. Patricia nodded slowly, as if deciding how much to reveal. Mary knew her father had a past. They all did. Her mother, Ellen, especially. Ellen had married him in Sacramento, knowing nothing about his history. But one night, shortly after they arrived in Arizona, he told her everything. Every identity, every crime, every desperate attempt to escape who he'd been. She pulled out a small leather journal from a drawer. "This belonged to Ellen. Mary kept it hidden for decades, then passed it to my grandmother before she died. She made her promise to protect the family's reputation. But I think the truth matters more than reputation now." The journal was Ellen's private record, written in her careful script. The entries began in 1887, shortly after the family fled Sacramento. Robert read aloud, his voice quiet. "William told me his real name tonight, James Callan. I have heard that name, seen it on wanted posters. My husband is the outlaw the territory feared. Yet when I look at him, I see only the man who tends our children with infinite patience, who reads to them each evening, who weeps when he thinks they cannot hear. He stole to survive after the law abandoned him. He killed no one. I will not judge him for fighting to live." Later entries detailed their life in Arizona. James, calling himself William, worked tirelessly on their homestead. He studied law books, teaching himself the legal knowledge that would help protect their land. He attended church, helped neighbors, slowly built a reputation as a reliable man. But Ellen also recorded his nightmares, his fear of discovery, his guilt. One entry from 1889 read, "He holds our children at night and whispers apologies they cannot understand. He believes he has condemned them to a life of hiding. I tell him he has given them a father who loves them. The past is unchangeable. The present is ours to shape." Patricia wiped her eyes. Ellen knew who she'd married, and she loved him anyway. Mary said her parents' marriage was the truest love she ever witnessed. Her father died in 1902, quietly, at home. No law ever found him. He was buried as William Douglas, respected community member. With Ellen's journal as confirmation, Robert returned to Arizona determined to find any official records that might have documented the Douglas family during their years near Tombstone. The key was Marshal Edward Garrett, the lawman who'd investigated the water dispute in 1888 and noted William Douglas's unusual legal knowledge and nervous demeanor. Garrett's personal papers had been donated to the Arizona Historical Society in 1920, 2 years after his death. Robert spent days reading through the marshal's meticulous notes, journals, and correspondence. Garrett had been a thoughtful lawman, more interested in maintaining order than collecting bounties. In a journal entry from April 1888, Robert found what he'd been searching for. Investigated dispute at Douglas property today. The man is educated, well-spoken, and clearly uncomfortable with my presence. He resolved the water conflict fairly, citing territorial law with precision. His hands bear scars I recognize from years of law enforcement, the marks of a man who has worn restraints. I pulled wanted posters from my files tonight. James Callan, reported dead in 1886, matches Douglas's general description. But the dead don't raise families and farm desert land. If Douglas is Callan, he has earned his peace. The man I met today is no threat to anyone. Sometimes the law's greatest service is knowing when not to act. Margaret, reading over Robert's shoulder, whispered, "He knew. The marshal knew and chose to let him be." Further entries revealed Garrett's ongoing, quiet observation of the Douglas family. He noted William's participation in community barn raisings, his donations to the church despite limited means, his patient teaching of reading to neighboring children whose parents were illiterate. In 1891, Garrett wrote, "Past the Douglas farm today. The children are thriving. The eldest boy has a natural gift for numbers. Douglas himself has become a valued member of our community, sought out for his judgment in disputes. If this man is James Callan, then Callan died long before 1886. The man who lives on that homestead is William Douglas in every way that matters. I will take this knowledge to my grave." Robert discovered that Garrett had been true to his word. Despite submitting regular reports to territorial authorities, the marshal never mentioned his suspicions about Douglas. He'd made a moral choice, deciding that rehabilitation and community contribution mattered more than past crimes. But there was one more document, a letter Garrett had written but never sent, dated 1895, addressed to the territorial governor. "I have witnessed too many young men destroyed by sentences that offer no hope of redemption. We create criminals by treating first offenses with such harshness that those convicted have no path back to society. I have also witnessed what happens when a man is given a chance to prove his worth despite his past. We must ask ourselves, is our goal punishment or protection? If we truly seek a safe and prosperous territory, we must learn the difference." Robert photographed every relevant page, his respect for Marshal Garrett growing with each entry. "Garrett gave him a gift," Margaret said, "the chance to be the man he wanted to be. And Douglas honored that gift. He built a life, raised a family, contributed to his community. He proved Garrett right." Robert stood before the assembled board of the Arizona Historical Society, his presentation displayed on the screen behind him. Months of research culminated in this moment, the unveiling of a story that challenged simple narratives of outlaws and lawmen, criminals and citizens. "The photograph we've been examining," Robert began, "shows William Douglas and his family in 1889. But it also shows James Callan, wanted outlaw. And more fundamentally, it shows a young man named James who was orphaned, desperate, and brutalized by a justice system that offered no compassion. All three identities belonged to one person." He walked through the evidence methodically. The arrest records from 1878, the wanted posters from 1882, 1886, the suspicious death report, the Sacramento embezzlement investigation, the Arizona homestead records, Ellen's journal, and Marshal Garrett's notes. Each piece added depth to the portrait of a man shaped by circumstances, mistakes, and ultimately, determination to change. The scars on his hands tell the story of his youth. A young man who refused to accept captivity, who fought against restraints, even when fighting was hopeless. But those same hands built a home, farmed harsh land, and held his children with gentleness. Both truths coexisted in the same person. Margaret presented the genealogical research, showing how the Douglas children had become productive citizens, their descendants contributing to Arizona communities for generations. This is the legacy of second chances. Not just one man rehabilitated, but an entire family tree of people who existed because Marshal Garrett chose mercy over blind adherence to the law. The board members listened intently. Dr. Emilia Rodriguez, the Society's president, spoke first. "This challenges our traditional narratives about the Old West. We tend to separate people into categories, outlaws or citizens, criminals or law-abiding. Your research suggests these categories were more fluid, more complex." "They were," Robert agreed. "The frontier attracted people running from their pasts. Many found redemption in new identities and fresh starts. Marshal Garrett's choice wasn't unique. Many lawmen made similar decisions, understanding that rigid enforcement sometimes contradicted justice's deeper purpose." Another board member raised concerns about glorifying criminal behavior. Robert addressed this carefully. "We're not excusing theft or law-breaking. The young James Callan made choices that harmed others, particularly the stagecoach companies and passengers he robbed. But we're also not ignoring the context, a justice system that responded to a desperate teenager's theft of food with brutal imprisonment and no support for rehabilitation. The story isn't about celebration, it's about understanding how circumstances shape choices, and how people can grow beyond their worst moments when given opportunity." The discussion continued for over an hour. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez called for a vote on including the full story in a new exhibit on frontier identity and justice. The motion passed unanimously. Patricia, attending the presentation, wept quietly as she watched her ancestors' complexity acknowledged rather than simplified into hero or villain. After the meeting, she approached Robert and Margaret. "You gave him back his full humanity, not just the criminal, not just the reformed man, but the complete person. That's the greatest gift you could have given our family." 6 months after the presentation, Robert stood in the Arizona Historical Society's newest exhibition room. The photograph of William Douglas and his family occupied the central wall, enlarged to show every detail, including the rope scars that had started the entire investigation. Around it, carefully curated panels told the complete story. James Callan's youth and arrest, his criminal years, his transformation into William Douglas, his family life in Arizona, and the descendants who carried his legacy forward. But the exhibit went further. It explored the broader context of frontier justice, examining how many people sought second chances in the West, how law enforcement navigated between punishment and mercy, and how communities often accepted reformed individuals as full members. Marshall Garrett's journal entries were featured prominently, his thoughtful observations providing a lawman's perspective on the complexities of justice. Visitors moved through the exhibit slowly, reading Ellen's words about love and acceptance, studying census records that showed the Douglas children's normal, productive lives, and examining wanted posters alongside homestead documents. The juxtaposition forced viewers to confront their own assumptions about crime, punishment, and redemption. Patricia attended the opening with 3 generations of her family, her children and grandchildren, all descendants of the little girl in the photograph. They stood together before the image, studying the faces of ancestors they'd only known through stories. "Look at his eyes," Patricia's granddaughter said softly. "You can see the worry, even in a formal portrait. He was still afraid." "He lived with that fear for 15 years, Patricia replied, "until he died peacefully in his sleep, never caught, never betrayed." Marshall Garrett kept his secret, and so did everyone else who suspected the truth. The community chose to see William Douglas, the man who helped his neighbors and raised his children well. A young couple approached Robert as he stood near the exhibit. "This is incredible," the woman said. "We usually think of history as simple, good guys and bad guys. But this shows how complicated real people were." "Are," Robert corrected gently. "People are still this complicated. We still make mistakes, still struggle with circumstances, still hope for second chances. The past isn't different from the present in that way." Margaret joined him, having just finished a tour for a school group. The students asked good questions. One wanted to know if William Douglas should have turned himself in, accepted punishment for his crimes. Another asked if the law should forgive people who work hard to change. These are the questions we need to keep asking. A local journalist approached for an interview. "Dr. Hayes, some critics have said this exhibit romanticizes criminal behavior. How do you respond?" Robert considered his words carefully. "We're not romanticizing anything. We're presenting the full complexity of a human life. James Callan robbed stagecoaches that harmed people and was wrong. But he also became William Douglas, who contributed positively to his community for 15 years. Both things are true. If we only focus on one aspect, we miss the opportunity to understand how people change." As the day progressed, Robert watched hundreds of visitors engage with the exhibit. Some left angry, feeling Douglas should have faced justice. Others left thoughtful, reconsidering their views on redemption. Many left simply moved by the story of a man who'd fought hard to become someone better. Late in the afternoon, an elderly man approached Robert. "I'm a retired federal judge. I've sent countless people to prison over my career. This exhibit has me questioning some of those decisions. Not whether the people were guilty, they were, but whether the sentences I imposed allowed any possibility of becoming what William Douglas became." As the museum prepared to close, Robert stood alone before the photograph one final time. The scarred hands that had sparked this investigation now represented something more than evidence of a criminal past. They symbolized the marks life leaves on everyone, the scars of struggle, the evidence of survival, the physical manifestation of a journey from one identity to another. The afternoon light streaming through the exhibition room windows caught the photograph at an angle. William Douglas, James Callan, James the orphan, stood frozen in time, surrounded by the family that had given his life meaning. Patricia approached, touching the frame gently. "Thank you for seeing all of him. The scared boy, the desperate young man, the criminal, and the father. Thank you for understanding that he was all of these, and that his story mattered." Robert thought about all the photographs still waiting in archives and attics, hiding similar stories beneath their faded surfaces. How many other complex lives remained undiscovered, reduced to simple labels, or forgotten entirely? The exhibit would remain open for 2 years, challenging thousands of visitors to reconsider their assumptions about justice, identity, and redemption. And the photograph would continue to draw people close, inviting them to zoom in not just on physical details, but on the deeper truth, that every human being contains multitudes, and sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is the willingness to see someone in their full, complicated humanity. As Robert locked the exhibition room for the night, he glanced back at the enlarged photograph one last time. William Douglas's eyes seemed to meet his across the decades, carrying a message that transcended the specifics of his story, that people are always more than their worst moments, that redemption is possible, and that sometimes the truest justice lies not in punishment, but in the opportunity to become someone better.